Hi, it's Dan again with Managing Digital and my series of videos about what is this IT for IT standard useful for. I talked in the last video about tool rationalization and the IT landscape, the IT management tools landscape, which people have used to take up to 20% out of their cost base in just license charges and maintenance charges for software that they don't really need. Go watch that video if that's interesting. What I'd like to talk about today, also very interesting, is how can I assess how well I'm doing in my semi-automated digital factory? What can I do to raise my game? And again, the IT for IT standard is very useful for that and has been used for that. I told you in the previous video that we have a set of functional components that are described in the IT for IT model, the blue boxes. We have data that is described that is essential to end-to-end transparent management of the IT landscape. But we also have detailed functional requirements for each of the functions, and we have detailed requirements against each of the data objects that tell us what is the minimum amount of information, because ultimately this is all about data. It's about operational data, about how do we do our work. What is the minimal amount of information that we need to collect in order to do things like understand who this server is for, know how many people are actually using our digital product, understand what our obligations will be over time. All of this stuff is embedded in the model at a level of detail. So when I go into a company to do a what I call digital factory assessment, we will focus in on perhaps one of the functional components, but usually we'll focus in on an area, some subset of this model. And people who have looked at IT for a while will perhaps look at these four big, what we call capability groups, which were sort of incorrectly called value streams in previous versions: strategy to portfolio, uh, requirement to deploy, and so on. Those are groups that represent roughly functional areas in an IT department and an IT division in a company. So it does make sense to group those that way to talk about how do these different functions work together? Where is the data? How good is the data? Do the data integrations exist? Do the data flows exist? And do the processes exist that we need to have in order for this model to scale up? And that's really the important question. It's not that hard to put a team of 5 or 6 people together to start building a mobile app, and you can use Azure DevOps, and they have some tools that can do that. They can get user stories from users. They can see whether the users like the things they've built and say that's really good. We'll put it in production. If it breaks, well, we move fast to break things, so we'll just fix it because we're agile. So we worry less about that than we used to. That's an approach that people take. There are some issues with that approach that I'll talk about in a different video. However, from an IT for IT point of view, from a digital factory assessment point of view, we would look at that and apply the criteria that are in the IT for IT standard. We may borrow some things from COBIT, which is the IT governance standard from ISACA, and we may borrow some other things from our own experience and be able to go on with a template. So I can ask the people in that team, you're doing this function. Tell me about the tools you're using. Tell me about the data that you're consuming. Where does it come from? How much do you know about how good it is? Do you have an integration between policy and requirement? Tell me about your policy data. Where is it held? Is it held? Can you reference it with a URL and a name at least? Is it actually held as data that is automatable, that I can map directly to a requirement, that I can map directly to a test case, that I can use in my testing environment? Is it that automation conscious, or is it maybe a bunch of PDFs in a SharePoint, and all I really have is a URL and a name of a document? If that's what it is, or whatever it may be, who owns that? Who's in charge of that? How up to date is it? How sure are you that the data you're using is correct? What do you know about the data you create yourself? Do you know who it's for besides yourself? Do you know who expects to consume that data, such as the information I would need on the service desk to understand why is this server down from a business perspective? That is, who was this server for? Who is about to call me and say, help, I'm broken? I knew that when I started my software project, or when I bought in some software or contracted for some kind of service at the front end of that chain. Do I still know anything about that when something's in production? Sometimes not. That's a problem. The IT for IT model describes that. The digital factory assessment is a way of drilling into how do you actually do your work? Where is the data that you're using? Where are you keeping and managing the data that you're creating? Where are the people who are going to want that data later? And are you creating all the data that they will need and putting it somewhere useful? And please don't tell me, I've heard this so many times, oh, it's on the SharePoint. That's all right. No, it's not all right. That is not good enough. Not if you want to scale up an automated digital factory. So we'll go into the client, we'll select the area that we're going to work on, and we'll give a score of compliance to a specific set of about 450 specific requirements against how these functions ought to work, how that data should be managed, and we will come back with information about who owns it, where it's missing, what are the integrations that don't exist, what is the data that doesn't exist or that's 5 years out of date, and we can apply that to a plan to raise the game, which corresponds to, in a way, what I talked about in the last video of reducing the number of software items that you're paying for in order to try to manage these things, because, in fact, you won't need as much of that stuff if you start to seriously look at how do I automate my digital factory at scale. We'll talk more about that in the next video. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please hit subscribe. That helps me a lot. If you'd like to talk more about it, take some training, get some advice, have a digital factory assessment, please get in touch with me. The link is in the information below, and there's a QR code in the goodbye screen that you can click on if you want to get in touch right now. So thank you very much. See you at the next time.